Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry about the delay. We had some technical issues with our webinar platform, but I'm so glad that all of you guys are joining us for this webinar. My name is Susanna Song. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications at Highwire Networks. This webinar about incident response is quite timely due to the circumstances and unpredictability around COVID-19. We here at Highwire Networks actually planned this topic months ago. It was supposed to be a tabletop simulation. However, we scrapped that and now we have this virtual experience. This is part one of a two-part series. A lot of you RSVP'd already for that event. And we plan to have it probably sometime later this year. Again, everything is so fluid, things are changing. But instead of role playing and having small group discussions, this will again be a webinar. We still hope to make it interactive for everyone. There will be a Q&A session at the very end. So please submit questions. We will have David and Phil answer those questions again at the end of the webinar. I hope we can all leave with one or two takeaways that we can prioritize. Some of you guys may already be experiencing crises with your businesses due to COVID-19 and this pandemic. But we again hope that you guys will grasp the importance of having a plan and being prepared, whether it's a cyber attack or a big disaster. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you my two colleagues. I want to welcome Chief Information Security Officer Phil Burnett. You'll see him in the window to my right, and also our Chief Technology Officer, David Barton. Both are tremendous human beings. They are great to work with and they are full of knowledge. Both have 20 years of cybersecurity experience and leadership under their belts. And a fun little tidbit about them, they both are veterans and they got started in cybersecurity when they were in the military. So again, without further ado, good morning, David, and good morning, Phil.
Good morning, everybody. This is Phil Burnett, the CISO here at Highwire Networks. Before we dive into this, I wanted to just send out thoughts and prayers to anybody who may be impacted by the COVID-19 and also the other flu that's not getting much attention, the type A one. It's pretty impactful as well, and inviting everybody to be sure to hunker down and do what you need to do to stay safe and stay healthy. My current role as the CISO for this organization encompasses all the things that you would expect. Watching the various security things that I need to monitor, policies, procedures, compliance, etc., but also managing the Overwatch platform, which is our XDR-based SOC and response tools, as well as the associated packages that come with it. As Susanna said, my background, I started in the military doing acoustic intelligence all around the world. From there, I learned to manage and protect those very systems that I learned to operate. After that, I worked in the government for a while and as a contractor, and wound up in healthcare as a CISO a couple of times, doing deep dives into HIPAA and all the related regulations around that, PCI, etc. And then came here to help grow and continue my career in the security field. I've done global incident response for huge manufacturers, and many other interesting things. And I look forward to this webinar with you folks. David.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Barton. As Phil and Susanna mentioned, I'm running technology for Highwire. I've been in the role for a short time, but have enjoyed getting to know everyone and look forward to sharing some of my background with you and how we might be able to help you think through ransomware. My background, like Phil's, I started in the military. One of the things you may have noticed is we're both military and we're both bald, and I think that's a function of being in the security field. We did have hair at one point, but it's all those late nights of worrying about the bad guys and what they're doing that caused the glare that you might be seeing. I might have to put some powder on my head. I don't know. My background, I started back in '89 building classified and unclassified networks in the Air Force. And when I got out, although there wasn't a discipline around information security, I still spent my time building and securing networks. Started at interesting story. I deployed the first checkpoint firewall for Wells Fargo back in the day, and that's a long time ago. And so I've spent time in healthcare. Like Phil, I've spent time in telecom. I spent 15 years between Sprint and AT&T building security programs. And when I got out of telecom, I really have been in smaller companies where we're more mobile, more able to adjust to the business demands of our customers, those kind of things. So I've been doing this for a while, and look forward to helping you folks think through ransomware and what you might do if you're unfortunate enough to be a victim.
Okay, so the second part of this slide here is how the tabletop exercises work. And originally, our plan was to have handouts and scenario cards and things for people to consider. And later on in this slide deck, there's a couple of examples of the thought processes that go through particular roles in an organization. Just this morning, there was an earthquake in Salt Lake City. So besides the COVID-19, there's an earthquake going on. There's some scenarios that we were going to introduce, particularly like what they had in Japan 9 years ago, was the earthquake that was followed by the tsunami, which is followed by a nuclear cleanup disaster at their power plants. So you can see that when you do a tabletop, you can plan for one, but there's always a contingency or unexpected circumstance that you have to also be ready to deal with. So how tabletops work basically is you think of a scenario, you pick the audience. So who is the audience? Who are you trying to test and evaluate? And then who is the report going to go to at the end? So what we do typically is we go through the initial ground rules and the instructions on how and what we're going to do. And then we gradually introduce scenarios and changes, and then we pause. The best part of tabletops is when you get the collaboration between the parties. There's a synergy that develops and a camaraderie around answers and ways to do things. I've had people share scripts back and forth on, hey, this is how we did it at company X and Y, and all these things. So the tabletop is critical for a collaboration, but at the end, it gives you a takeaway that you can take to your executives. And if you are an executive, you take it to the board. You say, here, these are the ways that we're preparing for emergencies like this. For example, the earthquake by itself, there's a lot of physical security and physical things that you have to think of. But as it progresses and ages, if you will, there's things about like, getting people to, safety first. How do you find the people? How do you restore power? How do you do all those things? But then if it's followed by a tsunami, then you're thinking, wow, we have buildings and people and things that could be inundated and underwater. So there's a lot of things that we do in the tabletops that we're looking forward to when phase 2 happens, that we can have you here with us and go through those. David?
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is you've heard the term muscle memory. Responding to incidents is really about muscle memory. And if you've thought through what it is that you need to respond to, then when it happens, it's easier. And so from an exercise objectives, we want to talk through how to prepare, right? Because the old adage, those who fail to plan are going to fail. We have to plan. We have to be prepared. We've got to think through the business recovery. I tell people all the time that if we're not making money, we don't need to be here. And so if you can't recover the business, you won't be there. And I think we're seeing some ideas around that with this COVID-19. We've got to be prepared for the longer perspective. How are you going to assess your cybersecurity posture, right? Because if you don't know what you're protecting, which we'll talk a little bit about on the next slide, it's hard for you to think about how you're going to restore that. I think the other piece is you have to have stakeholders. You have to be able to share that information across your organizations. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. The other piece is and I'm throwing a lot of colloquialisms out there, but you have to begin with the end in mind, right? If you don't know where you want to be when the bad thing happens, you can't think about what my scope and level of effort is. So think about what the end looks like, and then start to work backwards. And let's go to that next slide, please, Susanna. There we go. All right, so let's talk about and the anatomy of a ransomware attack. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, so just bear with me. And I know you've all heard about this before, or examples of ransomware. One piece of data that I was going to look up to refresh this morning, ransomware. The latest stat I saw, and Phil, you may have an update on this. The FBI said ransomware is going to be a $2 billion to $6 billion industry by 2024 or something to that effect. What that means, guys, is the bad guys have incentive. We're going to continue to see the bad guys going after that revenue, and it's our job to help prevent that. And how do they do that? Well, in most cases, it starts with an email, right? We've all seen those emails, and sometimes they look just like your bank. They look just like Bank of America. They look just like Amazon. And it's challenging at best for our customers who aren't necessarily security mindset to find those and understand those. And so it's important for us to focus on, as part of your end game, you need to be thinking about awareness right now. You need to be thinking about, how do I prevent ransomware? Well, it starts with the user, which is where this flow chart comes in, right? The email gets sent. In most cases, ransomware or phishing campaigns or spam email that leads to ransomware, if you look at it, those websites typically have a shelf life of about 3 to 5 days. So a good way to tell, if you're a security guy, if that ransomware email is bad, is go look at the website. How long has it been in business? Fortunately, there are tools out there that will help you detect those things, so you may not have to go look them up yourself. But fundamentally, understanding the bad guy, the behavior, if the website is less than 5 days old, if it's not encrypted, if it's not running certs, or it's a self-signed cert, it's probably bad. The problem with spam filters is they don't necessarily look at it at that level, and so email is getting through the spam filter. It hits your user's inbox. Most times those particular emails have a call for action, right? They say click here to confirm your credentials, click here to confirm your coverage, click here to reset your password because it looks like someone's logged into your account. And as users, it's our human nature to want to respond, right? So what do? We click that link. Now, if you back up to the idea that the website's been around 3 to 5 days, the AV your AV is probably not equipped to catch it, right? Because it's signature based. It doesn't know what to do with it, so it allows it. And so in this case, you've got ransomware that has gone through your spam filters, it hit an inbox, your user clicked it, and your antivirus has failed. So what happens next? Well, that executable code goes back to the website that's 3 to 5 days old. And again, I'm focusing on that because this is one way to help stop those APTs. It goes back to that website and downloads some code. And if you look at that very next one, it launches a process. So how do you get ahead of that? Well, you need a tool set that looks for new processes running, right? You need something that evaluates that. If your tools don't pick that up as a new process, you're not going to stop the malware at the delivery phase. Once it starts running, it does a lot of bad things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But ultimately, the malware copies itself to a registry. So if your user turns itself off and turns the machine off and it comes back on, they're still infected. So it's self-preservation, if you will, of that ransomware. It leads itself to the next phase is if you don't catch it or you don't turn your machine off, that machine connects to a command and control server somewhere. So you need tool sets that are thinking about and looking at traffic destined for a command and control server. If you don't have that, then all of those other security tools that have been in line up to that point, they're failing. Your command and control detections are failing. The next phase is in that CNC activity, you get to command to go ahead and start encrypting. Again, here's where if you've got a tool set running on your endpoint that looks at anomalous commands and anomalous processes, you'll catch that encryption. And even if you may not be able to catch it and stop it immediately, you'll know it's happening right away. And then you have an opportunity to put your action plan into place, which is how do we respond? And then, I think fundamentally, you get a ransom note. I don't know if you've seen any of the recent ones, but they used to be really scary looking. And if you've seen the movie Saw, that clown mask with the blood on it and all that stuff, that was one of the early ones. And when that popped up on your screen, I'm telling you, your heart probably, jumped through your chest. And it's like that Want to Get Away commercial where everybody gets infected in the office and that face starts glowing and the blood, and it just scared the crap out of everybody. But fundamentally, they're asking for money, right? And they're asking for Bitcoin. And so your data is now encrypted. You've gone through this process, this anatomy of a ransomware attack, and your data is now unusable. And the last step there, if you notice, the ransomware is now trying to go across your network. You really are having a bad day at this point, which I'll come back to my earlier point. If you don't have a plan in place for this bad day, it's going to be a bad week or a bad month. And in a lot of cases, smaller, mid-size and smaller companies aren't going to survive. I know that sounds like gloom and doom, and there's bigger issues in the world today, but ransomware has put businesses or companies out of business. Phil?
Yep. So we'll talk more at the tabletop about examples of those. But part of the tabletop exercise as well is one of the objectives is to make sure that we simulate all the different roles. So we have a guy who maybe shows up and he's your rock star sysadmin, or maybe he's a new guy. We hand him your CEO, COO card. We say for this particular exercise, you're going to be a decision maker. Look at these things that you're going to have to worry about. Most of the sysadmins I know don't think about cyber insurance or liability, who to talk to, who's the lawyer, accounts, prioritizing, delegating, calling in resources, calling contractors. All of those things handed to a sysadmin, he's going to start feeling the pain and feeling the pressure. Along with sales and marketing, their primary role is communication. We need to figure out how to communicate outbound to clients, inbound to clients, external. I mean, who formulates the message to give to the CEO, COO, or the trusted person for the lawyer in a lot of cases to communicate that there's a problem in your organization. Those are critical. And a good friend of mine often reminds me that words matter. So the way that message is crafted, the way it's delivered is very critical when it comes to liability, when it comes to claiming responsibility, when it talks about the steps along the path to getting whole again. All of those things matter. So those messages need to be well thought out and reviewed by a competent legal attorney or authority so that you can make sure that the message is clear. That's the way it needs to be approved. And then the technicians. So the guys who actually wear the smart hands, the boots on the ground, locking down the systems, making sure that the backups are isolated and are not infected, and making sure that the critical parts of this are all done. But if any one of these fail, the whole project fails. So we need to make sure through tabletop exercises, on where our strengths and weaknesses are. You can do a SWOT analysis for the old timers like me, who remember doing SWOT analysis on people and places and processes. And in this case, you would find out what are the strengths, what are the things that you did well, and document them. And the areas that you need help, you reach out to somebody who's a trusted advisor, your MSP or MSSP, whoever your consultants are. Reach out and ask those questions. Say, hey, we need some help building or filling in the gaps in our systems. And a lot of that is help with scanning your systems, looking for exploitability, looking for outdated systems. There may be a system in the corner that rarely gets used, but you fire it up and it's a really old Windows 7 version that does a critical a function. So at one of my previous companies, in the corner of this huge office, they had a computer they turned on once a month that had this little function it would do in some reconciliation of some claims. And nobody ever thought to look at it and see what the weaknesses were. And when they looked at it and they started analyzing it, the thing was full of holes and was easily exploited from the internet. So fortunately, we found it and got it fixed. But those are the kind of things, because sometimes a computer in a corner that's used once a month, the code is old, so the process hasn't been updated. So all of those things need to come to light during this tabletop exercise. And primarily, those would be targeted for if you're going to use the tabletop to not only do end-to-end like a DR situation, but a micro focus. Let's say you're going to look at your, you've upgraded firewalls. Let's see how the new firewalls work and our processes. Did we update those? Is the code updated automatically? Do we have a patch schedule? All of the things that you're going to look at, and if you were to go to my favorite framework, which is the CIS 20, go through there and look at each of those 20 things. If you do those 20 things and you do them fairly well, you're better than 80% of the other companies out there. But unfortunately, there's a word of caution too, because the last 20% is almost as hard as the first 80. So let's make sure that when we're talking about getting things done, you put them in the right priority, and you make sure that you build on the foundation and don't do something that undoes a previous step. A lot of the times that happens, people want to make changes and do such, and it undoes a security control. Let's say you hardened all your servers and you come back and start patching and adding and doing things. You have to reconfirm that your hardening efforts remained intact, and if you can, has increased. David?
So, I think here we talked about the whole idea. You need to be prepared. Part of that preparation is you need a plan first, right? So you need a plan to make a plan, fundamentally, and that plan needs to have some distinct steps, right? Preparation, which is what we're talking about at the moment. Identification. When I talk to folks a lot, I always ask them, what are your crown jewels? And most people don't know, frankly, most people don't know what that is. They don't know what's the most important asset to their organization outside of their people. And so thinking through what's the most important, what do I need to protect, will lead you to your response plan. So the security incident occurs. What do we do? Who do we call? And I think if you look at the previous slide that Phil had up, you've got three groups of people. Sorry, the one right before that. 3 groups of people that you have to make sure are lockstep key stakeholders involved in the incident. You're going to say, well, do we involve our CEO? Fundamentally, yes, because the risk in a pure risk management framework, the risk stops with your CEO. You may not need them for every meeting, and in most cases you won't, but you're going to want them involved. So understanding who those stakeholders are, if you could fast forward, please, Susanna, one more. Once you understand who they are, you build an action plan for each group. Sometimes the incident may not require a response. So, if you've got a box that's on the internet and it's got no proprietary data and it gets hacked, do you have much risk? And that's where having a risk methodology in place helps you determine that. And I think that's part of the planning process. But if there's no response that you need to take, then it's a really easy answer. let's assume that that server has PII data, and now you've got to do some notification. Well, you better kick off an incident response plan. So you set up your bridge, you get the right people involved, and then you start walking through that action plan, which ultimately leads to that disaster recovery and business continuity. And that's going to include a lot of things, right? Restoring the data, notifying potential people that their data has been breached or accessed or whatever the case may be. But you got to have that plan. You need to test that plan, which is where the tabletop comes into play. Yeah, let's go to the next slide, please. And
Okay, and this
Bill,
one,
this one me or
yeah, I'll
Go
take
ahead.
this one. So one of the first things in a tabletop, and then actually in an actual incident, you have to figure out when you first get notified that there's an issue, what's the level, what's the severity level or tier of this incident. And in this case with ransomware, once multiple spoof emails are reported, so let's say you're starting to get spoofed emails reporting from several departments over the course throughout your company, it could be 1 or 2 or 3 or 20. But how do you isolate or identify, is that a green, yellow, red, or a 1 through 10, whatever your grading criteria is. And in the instance, after you've analyzed that first email and you find out that it actually has an embedded link or an attachment that is known malicious, et cetera, after you've run it and your team has looked at it, or your SOC has reported that to you that there's malicious links in it, you change the tiers. You go from tier 1, which is just isolate and notify, all the way to forensic. So what changes that? So one of the questions you need to ask is, what are the key indicators that have this go from tier 1 all the way to max tier 3, 4, or 5, whatever your levels are in your organization? What immediate remediation or protective actions should be taken? So do you have an isolation system, a next generation antivirus that may have quarantined it? If you got Office 365, which I look at often in the advanced threat protection, what things are quarantined and who did they go to? Are those particular users targeted often? Office 365 also has a phishing report where you can go in and see who's being targeted in your organization. Maybe you should create a special group for them with higher DLP restrictions and other controls that will leave you less vulnerable. So who's responsible for the action is another step. Do you hand it off to the technical people? Is it something where it's a business decision? Do you isolate people? What do you do? And do you have these options and what they mean and how they impact the organization and your third party and customers? Have they been documented in plans? So the DR plan that we've been talking about, you're going to be referring to this documentation every step of the way. You should be turning pages, going step 1 through step 6 on the whole process, from identification, response, all the way to recovery. How are they activated? Do you have an out-of-band communication? If your email system is taken offline, how are you going to reach out to your people? They're not going to get the email through their phone because everything's shut down. In a on-prem type situation, you have cell phone numbers attached to roles and responsibilities. Do you have a backup person for each of those? I know, for example, here I have my cell phone as primary contact, but after hours, I also have my home phone. It's right next to my bed that will wake up the dead. So we've had that written and documented, so everybody that needs to reach me has that in their response plan. Will there be any additional reports or notification? If you're in healthcare and you got more than 500 records have been breached, there's a duty and a responsibility to report it. But like I said in an earlier slide, you need to make sure that that communication is well controlled and the narrative is controlled by you and your legal department to make sure that you're giving the right message at the right level. And the liability thing comes big time there in the reporting and notifications. So who is the primary, secondary, and tertiary points of contact? Have you identified them? Have you practiced it? That's the thing that we run into most when we get calls for people when they're asking for help, is that they want to know how often it's required and what they should do. And we tell them as often as necessary until your team is ready and can respond. I know David can also talk a little bit about the Air Force, but from the Navy. I did submarine, surface ships, and airplane acoustics. And we had in each one of those platforms, we had a deck of cards that were laminated that said, in an incident, this is what you do. And in the middle of the night on the mid shift, the watch officer would grab the cards and start handing them out, say, emergency plan, let's go. And those are kind of things you have to be ready to do. David?
Yeah, and I think the other piece that's going to come into play here that is very important, and we talked about training and practice, doing tabletop exercises, planning for those, preparing for those, for your DR and everything else, have to do that. But I think part of the importance is also prevention. How are you helping to equip your customers and users around prevention? Almost every, maybe not every, but if we look at the statistics, you'll find most ransomware started from a user. I remember I was talking to a guy and he says, I need you to make my network bulletproof. And I said, well, that's easy. Turn it off and send everybody home. Well, but if we do that, we don't make money. And the whole reason we're here is to generate revenue. So you have to have your users, you have to have the equipment. How do we make sure we're prepared? So you have a plan, but then you need to do basic cybersecurity awareness training. I think in my mind, and Phil, I'd like to get your opinion on this too. I think cybersecurity awareness is probably the largest ROI that you can talk to in an InfoSec world. We can't prove a negative, but we can prove that people aren't clicking on links. We do phishing campaigns that actually test them to see do they fall victim. Phil, you got an opinion on that?
I do, and also wanted to add, in some organizations that I've been in, large ones, for example, a manufacturing company, they're Fortune 100 global. I did incident response all around the world with them, and what I noticed was the senior technical people and some of the senior executives wanted to be excluded from the security awareness training, and I strongly encourage people to fight against that, to get show statistics, et cetera, that every person in your company should take the cybersecurity awareness training and then take the test, so that it's a tone from the top, as well as teaching them how to be aware. We use a product called Ningio, and we can give you some information on how to subscribe to that as well. It's a really cool little animated cartoon that takes 4 minutes and has a test after. What's beautiful about Ningio is it takes real world recent breaches and known incidents and puts them in a little cute kind of scenario, but then points out some really good tips on things. And we make sure it's 100% in our company. And we strongly push that every company have 100% end-to-end, everybody included in that. David?
And I think the importance there that I want to second with what Phil said is, if you have a cadence where you're teaching your people every month or whatever, and you have some certification that says they've taken a test, if and when you get a breach, you have that ability. Susanna, your desktop is, I don't know what happened there. But if you've got a plan and you get breached and the insurance company says, show me your due diligence, you can pull out your training program that says, every month I've done this, and here's been the response. And while we get the video fixed on my screen, there we go. I think we're on slide. There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that, folks. But the training, it needs to be specific. It needs to give them general directions. It needs to help them understand what their policy is and that they're responsible for. If you don't have a good security policy program that you make your employees or your customers, or you suggest your customers sign off on every year, it needs to be reviewed as part of that awareness program. If you're not talking about what their role is in an incident or a response, you need to be doing that as part of your awareness program. Passwords, Passwords are the easiest to breach. I don't know where we just changed again. Can you back that up? Thank you. And then the last one, which I think is probably the most important awareness training you can do, is to tell your folks who to contact, right? If they get a suspicious email, what do I do? Who do I call? What's the email? That needs to be, plastered on their monitors. That little sticky that has all their passwords written down should also have the number to call should something bad happen. But awareness, I can't stress it enough. It needs to be top of mind for your customers.
And also, if I may add, if they clicked on the link, it's good to know what action they took. Not only did they report a weird email, but did they click on the link? Because the sooner the responders know that the link was clicked, they'll understand where in their reaction plan that they have, where they need to go, saying already this could be infected. Get him or her off the network. Then let's go to the Exchange server. Let's track down every one of those emails, where they went. Let's look at the payload on the back end of that thing. Where did it go? Run virus total, IP void, whatever you got to do in the tools out there to find out what that link was designed to do. It could be simple adware, but it could be something very malicious.
Yep, exactly.
Next slide. So what are the requirements and processes to notify leadership of a cybersecurity incident and each severity tier? Well, I think that should be part of your plan. You should understand that when an event is significant enough to warrant leadership notification. So I'm not saying that you get a report from your SOC or your security provider or even your security team that, hey, we got malware on 1 or 2 machines or 10 machines. We have it controlled. They're all quarantined, that kind of thing. Those are just daily report metrics, and my teams give me a report every morning when I come in on the events that happened overnight, what the malware level is, what the response, if there are any open or pending. But I expect a call in the middle of the night if all of a sudden they say, hey, I got ransomware in the environment. We have it contained, but we need to notify people because we are an MSSP and an MSP, and that we're a big target. And the reason for that is we're a one-to-many. If they compromise our systems, all of our customer base would be at risk. And there's a lot of MSPs out there who are having problems like this, and they find it pretty difficult to put the genie back in the bottle after it's already done. So what resources and capabilities are available to analyze the intrusions? Do you have sufficient skill either on call or in your team, or do you have a service that handles this for you? So is it internal only? Is it external through a managed service? Do you have a computer incident response team? So if you have situations, which several of our clients do, is that when it reaches a certain level, they push the big red button, and Highwire happens to have a boots on the ground in 160 countries for our core business, and we can tap those resources along with some of our security partners in several of those places. And we have a plan in several large cities that can be activated very quickly for just this kind of situation. After the forensics examiners have come in, we can restore. We do the things we got to do. But do you have something similar like that? What about, is it through the private sector, or what's your plan on who do you go to? Have you discussed the situation with your insurance company? Like I said early on in this presentation, cyber insurance is something you need to have a conversation with often. And in my previous life at several of the companies prior, we actually would take and provide evidence of tabletop exercise, full-on DR and failover situations, and present them to our cyber insurance company. And in 2 cases, they chose to keep our rates at the same level rather than increase them, even though other clients who didn't have the level of response we did had increases of 5 to 7 to 10%. So that could be significant in your OpEx budget. You're going to be saving money, and that's a big deal in security because typically we're a cost center. If you can show return on investment in real dollars by reducing the renewal costs of a cyber insurance policy, then you're actually showing real value. Plus, you're also giving a sense of confidence and awareness that your CEO and board that would really like to capitalize on. And how do you communicate? We talked about earlier. Do you have just in daily or weekly or monthly? Do you have communications outbound to your partners or customers, letting them know that you're aware? For example, many companies, including ours, send out notifications about the COVID-19, how that we're taking the steps recommended by the government. And as you can see here in the office, we have everybody separated in offices and wiping things down, et cetera. But we're following the rules, but we're still not losing sight of our primary function and responsibility, which is providing security services for our clients. Next slide, please, David.
So, I think as we start to get closer to wrap up this conversation, a couple things I'll come back to one of my earlier adages. If you don't have a plan, if you fail to plan, you're going to fail. So part of that response to a ransomware event is kicking that plan off. And do you have an offline disaster recovery plan? If you don't, there's a lot of good resources out there, but you need to be thinking about that. Do you have a strategic plan for cybersecurity? Part of that plan has an assessment component. Are you bringing in third parties to assess where you're at and then putting a plan together? If you're not, you should, because those people who do that for a living are going to say, how are you going to handle a ransomware event? I mentioned this earlier. Cybersecurity policies are critical to a response program because you're holding people accountable to a policy that has been set and established at the top of your organization. Do you conduct regular security meetings? And these could be governance with the key stakeholders, but they could also be the key responders or the first responders, if you will, for an incident in your organization. So they need to be happening. And again, if you can document these things, hey, we had one meeting a month, we've had awareness training every month, we do table talks twice a year. To Phil's point, when you get audited for insurance rates for cyber insurance, you're going to come out ahead. In fact, if you haven't seen it lately, there have been incidents where cyber insurance companies have not approved payouts because their customers aren't doing the due diligence. So at the end of the day, if something bad happens and you have to use cybersecurity insurance, you've been doing all the due diligence along the way. Do you conduct regular cybersecurity awareness trainings? I think web-based is a minimum, but I also think having quarterly or twice a year where your security practitioners are talking to the whole company, I think that's important. And I understand some of that takes some political work internally to get approval to do those things, but it's still important. And then the last one, do you have an incident response plan? This takes a little bit of work because, again, you have to think through all of those scenarios we've already covered and put a plan together to respond. If you don't have a plan, I highly encourage you to be involved locally with your ISACA or any of the other groups who can help you craft this. They have resources available and other folks like Phil and I who've done this before and are happy to help. But get involved and see how other people are doing it and leverage that work for your own organization. Next slide, please.
All right, so who should be involved? I think we've talked through some of this in all the previous slides, but here's some examples of the roles and the thought processes that each of these roles should cover, right? So executive leadership, they own the cyber crisis response program. Your CSO, your CISO and your SOC manager do attack simulations. They're really the testers, and the senior management are the ones being tested. So they build a response plan, they have tabletop exercises, they work with the IT department and general employees. While at the same time, your tier 1 analyst and tier 2, 3 analysts also are evaluated. Do they do the response according to plan? Did they do the reporting correctly? Did they do any forensics or analysis? that was required. And a valuable thing with the tier 2, tier 3 is that they can do skills training and workshops with their IT department to show them what to look for, as well as the tier 1 or the junior analyst. So there's a lot of things here in this slide. I know it's packed in here, but these are the types of things that in part 2, we'll go through some examples of each of these and what those look like. And everybody needs to, swap seats. You need to jump across and become senior management. Maybe you're an IT guy. Maybe you become a CISO. You have external contractors. Who's managing and monitoring and communicating with those who they're critical resources to your company, but they happen to be external? Next slide, please. David?
Yeah, so I think this is especially as we're seeing the effects of COVID. These are just things to think about. Be prepared. Don't wait until something bad happens and then wish that you had put the time in up front. Be prepared. Part of that preparation has testing involved. Test your backups. If your backups are failing and you get hit with ransomware, you're going to probably end up paying the bad guys. So make sure your backups are accurate and current. Test your response plan. Understand what those events look like and build a simulation for it. And I know it's hard to think through that, but once you get a cadence of testing your response plans, it becomes easier. Part of that is playbooks, right? Build those playbooks. If I see this and this is happening, let me do these activities. Understanding what your vulnerabilities are. If you're in a castle with a moat, then my vulnerability is if we have a drought and now people can walk through my moat. So, and I know that's high level, but understanding what your vulnerabilities and your risks are, and then do you have a plan to eat for each of those risks? Some of those you're going to accept because they're expensive and you can't mitigate them. Some of those you're not going to be able to accept because they're going to cause your business to go out of, your company to go out of business. Therefore, you need to put a plan in place to address it. And then, the business continuity, I think we're seeing some of that now, right? And this will lead to one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A. Right now, we've got folks who are working from home. We've got governments around the country who are saying 50% of your staff need to be working elsewhere. How do you plan for that, right? So while you haven't lost access to your systems, you may not have all the tools in place to allow your folks to get access to them now. So how do you sustain while the systems are being restored or access is removed? What's your mean time to repair? And I know that's a fail question because it's really all about metrics. But what's your mean time to response? And what's your mean time to repair? And then the last one is one of my first points I made is if you know what your crown jewels are, those are your critical systems. Your response plan that you're building has to account for how do I get access back to those critical systems? How do I grant access to my employees or to parts of the company or our associates, whatever? If you don't know what's important, you don't know how to give access, you don't know how to restore, you don't know how to prioritize the business recovery. Next slide, please.
Okay, so before we get to the hot wash report, which some people may or may not know what it is, it's a FEMA term that they use, after action report, but that's really stage 8 in a tabletop type simulation. So quickly, I'll review what the other 7 are. Stage 1 would have been to explore and study what the ransomware was and what the response is. Stage 2 is critical one. It talks about dependency chains. How do things work? When one step is completed, how does it hand off smoothly and efficiently to the next during a cyber breach? Stage 3 is you present the incident scenario. Stage 4 is the team begins the breach response. 5 is we inject new events and add those curveballs I mentioned early on. And then stage 6, participant responses. That's critical. We get feedback from you. 7 is analysis and conclusions. We go through that and we get all the conclusions of what everybody thought was the right answer, because there is no wrong answer. And we do a hot wash report. Really, that's a snapshot in time of the things that the organization did well, the things that need improvement, and those are where you can ask for help from known trusted advisors or experts. You set a plan to meet and discuss the improvement strategy. So it flows right into from, we know what we're good at, we know what we're not so good at, here's a plan, here's how we do it, let's get and enable it. And then the hot wash remarks and comments is any other things that were noted. Were there particular people or roles that were exemplary? It's always good after an exercise to figure out who went above and beyond or thought outside the box. You need to rely on those people, the ones who handle the pressure under stress and pressure well, right? How do they respond? And they think outside the box. So those are the kind of things that would be in your hot wash report. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Phil. Thank you, David. We have 3 minutes left, and I want to respect your time. Again, I apologize that we started a few minutes late, but I wanted to get to the 2 questions. Jeremy Cullen asks, how can we protect our users against today's threat if basic antivirus and next-gen firewall is no longer enough?
David?
So I think the short answer is it's about defense in depth. You must have multiple layers of security to solve today's advanced and even not advanced threats. AV is one piece. Having network monitoring in place is another piece. Having phishing protection is another piece. Having web proxies is another piece. And if you think about it, at the end of the day, it's a castle wall within a castle wall within a castle wall, and ultimately, if the AV doesn't catch it, the next level of that castle wall, your proxy might, or your firewall might, or whatever. I think what's most important is having an integrated platform or an integrated tool set that sees all of those components and starts to correlate those and give you a much better chance of catching that behavior, that bad thing that's going to happen. You know, and Jeremy, I think the last part of that is we have to be better at teaching our people how to spot the bad guys or the bad activities so that they're not inclined to click on those links and cause us more risk.
And if I could add something to that too, Jeremy, is that you should seek out a trusted advisor and somebody who can assess. So they perform professional services to see what strengths and weaknesses, maybe a lightweight pen test or something along those lines. You have to perform assessments, because how do you know if you win the game if you don't keep score? So you need to look at assessing and scoring yourselves and seeing where you are on the maturity curve.
Okay, we have another question. In light of the bizarre circumstances, how do you feel about your own ability to respond to the changing landscapes and continue business continuity?
Well, we have a pretty diverse and remote workforce with plan A, B, C, D, so we can always revert to another situation or plan. You know, having VPN access everywhere, having vetted workforce, along with partners ourselves. We have people we can reach out to. For example, I believe Dave and I both are FBI InfraGard members, where we can upload snippets of code if we need to, or we can reach out if there's a situation. So having trusted partners and knowing who they are and being able to talk to them frequently. As soon as this COVID-19 passes, recommend getting back into CISO, CIO roundtables, go to conferences, learn, right?
All right.
Well, and I think what you're seeing, to echo on that response, you know, if you look just at the 4 panelists up here, we're all somewhere else, right? We are responding to these changing landscapes so that we can maintain business continuity. I think we have the right tool sets in place so that our folks can work anywhere. And we're still maintaining the security controls that we need to Jeremy's earlier question, to catch the bad activities before they become an incident for us.
Well, we are out of time. It's 9:31. I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar. Again, we will have a part 2 on this. It will be on-site and in person. For those of you who already RSVP'd, you will get invitations. In fact, everyone who joined us this morning will get invited. It will happen later on this year. Thank you. If you want to know more about Overwatch Managed Security, our website is highwirenetworks.com. Please check us out. If you have any other questions that you may think of later on in the day, feel free to email David Barton and Phil Burnett. I will be sharing their email addresses on the screen right there. So have a wonderful day. Again, please reach out if you do have any other questions.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time.